Well, first I would say that I was born in Latvia and in 1926, and you probably realize what it means. It means, as I'm looking all over you, I know that I'm the oldest person in the room, and probably any other room wherever I go, including a restaurant or a theater. Meeting me for the first time, a stranger asks, "What do you do? What do you do for a living?" "I'm a painter." "Ah, so you paint houses." There's just and I interrupt the person. "No, I paint pictures." "So you are an artist?" "I wouldn't say that. I'm just a painter who paints pictures." "So what do you do for your inspiration?" "From nature, I suppose." "Not really. I get it from my daydreams. I daydream much of the time, which gets me into a lot of trouble with people who would like to talk to me. Because when I daydream, I don't hear them, which makes them very, very angry. Especially my wife. And she's sitting here today with her daughter at her side. But the stranger wants more. And at other times, the times you don't, well, when you don't daydream, I write plays just to get away from my, well, you know what, and make me return to real life, to keep my mind as straight, as logical as I can. I'll buy that. But for relaxation, the times you're tired, upset, and anxious, I read poetry. It relieves me of my anxiety. And what are you reading now? For this occasion, I have selected a poem by Latvian poetess by the name of Mirza Kempe. She's an intellectual communist by conviction. She nevertheless has written poem after poem praising Soviet luminaries, from Lenin to Stalin to Lumumba to any other anti-capitalist politician in the West. For that she has been awarded by Soviet authorities every available prize and medal, and with all the economic advantages that come with it. Yet, during her hours of peace and silence, she has written a different kind of a poetry that was considered not publishable at the time. Her last poem, just before she died, "The Call of a Bird," struck a chord in me. And I'm going to read just the first line in my interpretation. "I still might live a long, long time, but would I get wiser? I think I will not. And that bird with a fiery call, catch I will not. I know I will not." Well, I think if I had been a poet, I would have done much better. So. "And she sees a bird flying above the treetops too high to reach me. And then as she kneels for a fraction of a second, she sees a bird darting through the reeds just above the water. But like in a fairy tale, she now would be satisfied with just one single silvery feather. But even that slips through her fingers, which makes her admit that she is now too old too weak even to touch it. And tired and exhausted, she sits down under that ever-wise, evergreen tree, asking for advice. Still now, far, far in the distance, she cannot escape the sound of the sweet, seducing call of the bird that makes her realize how empty and unfulfilling her life without true art has been. She died in 1974. During her last day, she warned the young budding poet. My relentless striving for recognition and fame killed my talent. And it pays to remember that there is still such a thing as God. And the tragedy of Mir's Temple may be just one of the tragedies experienced by so many called practitioners of arts today. A friend of mine, a director of plays, at the end of his life complains, "After all these years, I finally learned how to direct a play. And now, when I have so many good ideas, I am too old and weak to bring them to life." And then there's the extremely successful past playwright, old writer Maugham, has tales to tell about an actor who with hard work, bit by bit, had finally mastered the art of their craft, were now too old to get any of the parts they had dreamed about in their younger years. And now what about painters? The lucky ones in their old age, after having clarified their vision, were doing their best work. Just to mention, like, everybody knows Matisse, Vermeer, and our own Diebenkorn here from California. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are painters like Monet, who in his reigning years had developed a vision of grandeur by painting huge canvases of visually empty historical scenes. And I was shocked when I went to Giverny, and I was really shocked to see those paintings. And then there is also our own, for everybody, Picasso, who in the last years of his life, by repeating the same idea over and over, turned out several canvases a day by leaving behind some 1,500 paintings, now stacked in a warehouse, away from the eyes of the buying public. In his younger years, he had complained that his goal was to paint like a child. And perhaps now he did. And how about de Kooning, who, while suffering from late-stage Alzheimer's, confounded his critics, admirers, and museum directors by letting them exhibit his canvases in prestigious venues? Weren't they all looking for the same thing to the end? And what they are looking for, I think is a word again, is art. And I would say that the word is used too loosely. Most every little thing one does these days is called art. And those who practice it are called artists, of course. And there are so many of them that I get confused. And any time I get confused, I escape life in my daydreams. So I dreamed decently going through a dark forest, looking for that name, and by falsely paraphrasing the famous lines of Robert Frost. The woods are dark, the woods are deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Fortunately, I am finding that woods are much darker and deeper than I expected. And the trails are not as straight as I imagined. And they contain many traps covered with dead branches. And the first trap is called illustration. And I can spot it easily, but the second one, decoration, consisting of a deep, deep hole, is better disguised and much more dangerous. I know I must navigate between the two. The first appear in the painting by Gabriel Metsu. Like in every illustration, one is intrigued not by the work itself, but by the story it tells. During the 17th century, Dutch were great seafarers. They were away for months or years at a time, and the only way to communicate with their wives at home was by mail. And the painting depicts two of these wives. The seated woman on the left plays a sort of an indistinctly painted musical instrument. There's a shoe dropped in front of her. And the other woman stands in front of a half-covered picture of a sailing ship, thinking of her husband now far away. She holds a letter in her hand from her husband. It took me a while to figure out a meaning. The ridiculously positioned dog, probably painted as an afterthought to Metsu after the work was finished. But of course, dogs do have sensitive noses, and the animal recognized in the letter the smell of the master. I'm turning to the other woman, and only now I'm beginning to decipher the meaning of the ill-hanged picture above the seated woman's head, its frame partially covered by leftover bow from a funeral. Obviously, her husband is dead. Her life, like a picture above, is out of keel, and she is playing a lullaby in honor of her dead husband. A symbolism, of course. By being overwhelmed by such sorrow, I have absolutely no time to look for the visual beauty of the work itself. Now there's another picture called The Letter by the brewmaster Vermeer. In this painting, all you are seeing is a young woman with a letter, and since there is no immediate story to detract you, the attention now focuses on the almost contemporary design and luminosity of the work. So you're immediately drawn in the painting itself, and you don't really care all that much why she's there, what's she doing, etc. But unfortunately, the Vermeer's painting has nowhere the universal appeal of the tempera painting, Christina's World, done by the America's best artist illustrator, Andrew Wyeth. And in the eyes of the general public, the painting comes in as a strong second to Mona Lisa. Wyeth's Christina is a masterful example of nostalgia. In literature as well as in visual arts, it is the surest device of gaining recognition and even fame. And in Wyeth's tempera, nostalgia is so powerful that it supersedes everything else. It forgives the rather self-conscious, poorly drawn image of Christina's body. And I was really shocked because when I really looked at it, that he is probably one of the best draftsmen that we have had in the last 100 years. The ultimate strength of his work lays in its vagueness, where everyone looking at the painting, everyone in this room included, will see in Christina his own personal kind of nostalgia of the bygone days, and that may be the main reason for its wide popular appeal. The last two paintings looks like a tongue-in-cheek caricature, but it isn't. It's a self-portrait of a painter looking in horror at the death of Marat, and Marat was, in the Soviet Union at least, he was considered a left-hand lefty by the French artist David. And it's really meant to be a well-hidden political protest against the Soviet regime, like there were many protests. And you can express them only either in poetry, less in prose, but you can express it in some way in a painting. Next one is, as I go deeper and deeper, and of course the woods get darker and darker, and in my daydreams I'm just stumbling ahead without giving proper attention to my surroundings and paying the price for it by falling into the deep, deep hole by the name of decoration. And hardly any artist is entirely free from it. And I hate to admit, I am one of its, unfortunately, one of its more avid practitioners. Like any easy-to-understand plot in a popular novel, a good decoration by its nature is beautiful, easy on the eyes, and usually is the first one to attract the attention of the viewing public, including myself, of course, when I go to a show. And as a late art critic of San Francisco Chronicle, Alfred Frankenstein used to say, "You throw it like a raw meat to the dogs to keep everyone happy." Well, he meant, of course. And now, by being one of the dogs myself, I imagine sitting in the bottom of the hole dug in a very soft sandstone. It has names carved on its walls. The first one I notice is Vincent, because the letters are so large, in spite of being partially obliterated by the ravages of time. And I chose, I would say, it is probably one of the most decorative Van Gogh's paintings. You could hardly recognize it as Van Gogh, but he did paint it. And let me tell you, if you want to sell it, that would be the first one to be sold. And of course, there are other names which I consider quite decorative. And this man you recognize like a Diebenkorn. Here you see all those blues, and all those whites, and all those greens, and all those reds. So there's, I would say, there's every color you could imagine. So I would say it's a decorative painting, and when you look at his later works, he really didn't do them. He did a much better work. And then the next one, nobody will recognize, okay. If there wasn't a name on it, I wouldn't recognize myself. But it's a Mondrian, a painting by Mondrian, and it's a very pleasant, decorative painting that everybody would be proud to have on his wall, including mine, if I could afford it. Also a very decorative painting by the name of Preston. She works in LA, and there are some anonymous people. And this looked like something that you would find in a paint store, but it actually isn't. When you look at it closely, it's a very nice combination of neutral colors and other colors and greens. And I would say it's very pleasant. And the same with this, it's very impressive, I would say, oval. And the way how it's works around the edges, they are not quite as clear as one would have imagined. Also a very decorative painting that would fit on the wall in any house. So having gotten used to the poor light, I identify others, among them being Matisse, Roscoe, just to mention a few. But all of them, including some other or leftover decorators, one way or another, must have gotten out of the hole. I scribble my little name next to theirs and wait to be helped until two men come by who introduce themselves as art historians. And I wouldn't mention their names. They pull me out, and I can't imagine what I would have done without them. And another wood painting, and the woods get darker and darker, and trails crossing each other become more confusing. And a sentence by Andre Malraux comes to my mind. An artist has an eye, but not when he's 20. On a 91, I definitely would qualify. But no matter what he says, I still wish I were 20. Back then, with the blink of an eye, I could easily tell a good art from bad by writing pages and pages of it, and I really... Now, after reading it, I threw everything into a wastebasket, so they're all gone. It's just a repetition of empty words that I read so many times before. But in some of the most prestigious art magazines. Unfortunately, since that time, I still became more confused. All of a sudden, I see some light in the distance. I stagger until I come to a clearing in the forest, and I stop. Instead of being covered with grass, sand, and stone, the place has no bottom. It's all white, like covered by deep white fog. No color, absolutely nothing. Not a sound disturbs the silence. And only after a while it occurs to me that I must have arrived at the edge. But really, mind you, only at the edge of something that other people so freely call art. This is one of my last paintings that's half done and not finished, but you could probably see this white area of nothingness, really. So slowly, step by step, in order not to be sucked into the white nothingness, I walk gingerly along the edge until I hear at first, vaguely, of what sounds like a commotion, of people yelling at each other. And then I adjust my hearing aid. Coming closer, I discerned the voice of my late mother. She had earned her keep by teaching literature at the university. On the side, she spent all of her money of collecting paintings, and she really did. But her true and only love was poetry. She lived by poetry. And wrote reviews about it, and thought of it even while both of her legs were slowly being consumed by gangrene. And I think this is the last picture of her about 3 weeks before she died. And believe it or not, we're still discussing, fighting about a piece of poetry at that time. And then she usually says, in order to discuss a poem, you have to read it many, many times until you have learned it by heart. And she always emphasizes it is important to write about it, you have to learn it by heart. It's the only way, she said. But by looking at her now, then I was sure, I noticed fatigue and disappointment in her voice, and it was more disappointment than fatigue, I suppose. And it comes from one of her introductions of one of her books about poems. A discussion about a poem is nothing more than touching some of its aspects, like literary contents. No matter how incisively we are analyzing every line in a poem or a painting, something always, and maybe the most important part of it, remains unsaid and escapes our sensibilities. The irrational moment that defies definition. We can only feel it as the life of a particular work, whose only law is the law of beauty. But then I ask, but what about getting inside art? Taking the art apart? Mother wasn't much help. Until another prominent retired critic from New York chimed in, and she says, in front of the silence of a painting, all explanations sound like an unnecessary, disturbing background noise. And she had written about art all the time, and then of course she realized that it's all for nothing. And actually many critics, and it's a sad thing, feel that way. And then, of course, a young man who reminded me of a journalist from a well-known news magazine rushed by. And of course, his message was short. You are right. Around the work of art, criticism must always sound like a noise. So it's not much help either. And nor was the unbearable yelling of pro and con by those who assumed were a well-educated crowd of art critics, journalists, art historians, dealers, writers, and patrons of art. But because of the sound amplification of my high-tech hearing aid, the loud noise became too much for my brain. I quietly tiptoed away. And in my daydreams, I unwillingly returned to the Latvian poet Mirza Kempe and her bird with a seductive voice and its shiny wings that she never touched, not even a feather of it. Maybe it's true that, like God, art cannot be explained with words. It cannot be explained with words. It has to be experienced in a solitude and absolute silence. You talk to it, and maybe it may return your question with words of silence that nobody but you can hear. And I have to live with it. And so must the rest of us who have crossed the path of my subjective daydreaming journey to find it. So I think that's all. That's all that time permits. So thank you. Thank you.